Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Two Old Sexperts. I am one of your hosts, Sean McGill, joined by my friend and podcast co-host, Sharon Potter. Today, we're talking with you about dementia and sexuality. This does clearly impact all people, including those with developmental and intellectual disabilities. Today, we're talking about sexuality and dementia. And as you were saying, Sharon, we're seeing an influx of sexually transmitted infections in nursing homes. But when talking about the people that we support, we're seeing a number of people who are living much longer. And what that means is we're seeing aging happen clearly. And with that also comes dementia. And I think people just don't really understand dementia. They think it is just an aging disorder, and it's not. I've seen people when I worked for the Alzheimer's Association as young as in their 30s who were diagnosed with some form of dementia. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So we can try to help people understand this a little bit more too.
Yeah, and I think about, the need, and one of the things that, I was reading this article, and the need for touch is so important for all of us, just physical touch. I mean, we get lonely, but people cross lines when they don't know from one moment to the next. It just gets very complicated. So there were a lot of suggestions about just like a hand massage or exercise, keep people busy and active, and whether that's in a nursing home or in a group home. We're all humans and we all have the same needs. One of the things that I was impressed with is when they say, educate the person about, the boundaries and what have you. We do that. That's what we should be doing all the time with the folks that we work with. But we also have to educate ourselves.
Yes.
And, the direct care, well, all the staff. And I mean, it's a complicated issue. I remember my mom had dementia, and my dad was living in assisted living, and my mom was in an Alzheimer's unit, a dementia unit. And he had every meal with her. He just loved her dearly. And first of all, one time she said to him, "Where's my husband?" And he said, "Journey, I'm your husband." And she said, "You wish." She's pretty feisty. And another time they were sitting together at a table having a meal, and there was a woman on the other side of my dad who started to rub his arm. And my mother got up very, quietly and walked around behind my dad and behind the woman and tipped her chair over. And it was an incident that, had to get reported, and I had to, go in and we talked about it. But she maybe didn't know he was her husband, but she didn't want anybody touching his arm either. but there are things that, this was a very loving couple, and my mom it was gone. She didn't know anymore who he was, but there was a part of her that did. And, it's just very, very complicated. And another time, my dad, I mean, we're not talking about people with intellectual disabilities, but he urinated in the potted plant in the lobby. It's like, oh my God. So he exposed himself. And at that point, he had some dementia as well. And when I talked to him about it, he said, well, there was a line to go into the bathroom, and I just couldn't wait. But, he would never do anything like that. It was just, you're not thinking the same way, your process. And because of the parts of the brain that begin to leave or decay, I hate to use the word the brain decay, but it
literally does. And when you look at the brain, and we'll get in more depth about the umbrella of dementia. I see it as a big umbrella, and what causes dementia. I mean, this is a neurological disorder. You can only diagnose Alzheimer's with 100% certainty at the time of autopsy, and you can literally see holes in the brain. So the brain does decay. And I think for us and the work that we do, I don't have research to back this up. It's just been personal experience of working with individuals. I find it far more challenging to get people with developmental and intellectual disabilities diagnosed with some form of dementia. And I'm not sure why that is, but we definitely have to look at and talk about how dementia affects the brain, and it changes things, just as you were talking about sexual feelings and different behavior, impulse control. It changes people. And we have to be prepared and know how to respond to those things also.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers of people living with dementia is just incredible. People are living longer, so the numbers are just higher. I don't know when this piece was done, but 47 2.5 million people and 5 million with Alzheimer's. And I think that was a few years ago, this statistic. That's just really incredible. And the other thing that people that are my age now, the baby boomers, we lived in through the generation that was like sexual liberty and, freedom and, so maybe they're a little more comfortable with sexuality, but then they cross lines when they can't remember who's who and who they are at some point.
I found that's one of the most helpful things that you can do is to not challenge someone's inability to remember. And I still do this training with people. I have a picture. There it is, my grandmother. And clearly the listeners can't see the picture, but there's a picture of my grandmother holding me. I'm still the cute bald one in the middle with my sister. But she died she had Parkinson's. And you could just see and she couldn't remember people and she couldn't remember situations, and I saw certain people get really frustrated with that and challenge
Yes.
her, and she became more almost combative when people would be challenging it because it's painful for them too. I'm sure of it,
Yes.
that they can't
Yeah.
remember. Where I remember her calling me, she used to call me Jean all the time, and I didn't question or argue it. I knew that there was a connection and I loved her dearly. So I didn't care if she called me whatever. I just knew that I
Yeah.
had to maintain that connection with her too.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a tough one, and I do remember again with my mom. We're talking about these personal experiences, and her sister, who was closer to my age, so she's more like a sister to me, but she loved my mother so much. They were very, very close. And when my mother had dementia, Marlene would say, "Oh, my mother would say something, and Marlene would say, oh no, June, don't you remember it was this, or it wasn't that person, it was this person." And of course, my mother didn't remember. And Marlene was so frustrated. And she just tried so hard it was like she just was trying to hold on to her and stay with me, be who you always were. But she couldn't. And so we had long talks about
Facebook video that's been out for a few years, and it's this very tall, thin, older woman with beautiful gray hair sitting in a chair. She's not talking, she's not doing it. She just looks almost lifeless in this chair. She was a professional dancer, she was a ballerina. And I believe they started to play Swan Lake, the people
oh
around her.
my,
And you could just see her lifting her arms and lifting her legs and
oh
doing
my.
the poses and the dance, the rhythm of Swan Lake. It came
Yeah.
back to her in that moment. So you will, even for people with disabilities, and they have dementia, you will get those lucid moments
Hmm.
because the memory bank from long ago is still there.
Still there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I've seen that with music as well, all different kinds of music, that people will suddenly start to sing along with the song. And they remember, as you said, it's there, it's buried, but it's there, and it can pop up again. Yeah. So yeah, look, I mean, I just look at the numbers of people, and it's more prevalent in males and females, which I did not know that.
And we don't know
Yeah.
the reasons why. And some of the statistics that we're quoting, from 20 years ago, and there is a stat that says by 2030, those numbers, those millions that you were describing before, they're going to double. And
Oh boy.
unless you're reading research on an ongoing basis and keeping up with it, you want to make sure that you are, but that's not going to be fresh in our brains because we do the training, we report on those statistics. But for me, it's like, well, why? I'm always questioning, why do things come out the way they do? Traumatic brain injuries contribute a large majority of people who end up with some form of dementia down the road too. So when you think about males, athletes, football players,
Sports.
military people, I mean, there are far more women in the military now, but that is a huge issue at this point too, because we've been
Yeah.
at war nonstop. Desert Storm and all that's been going on since the 90s. I remember being in high
Yeah.
school and seeing,
Yep.
George Bush on the television, and we're at war, and that hasn't
Yep.
stopped. So
No.
we have to be ready for that issue too. Now, again, the people that we support are not going to war most often, but they have sustained many significant head injuries. I read, and people have been hit by cars, and they have been
Yep.
dropped, and it's there. So folks, we got to be ready and prepared to
Yeah.
deal with this too.
Yeah, I think about that. There's a specific category for football players that it's a specific kind of dementia. It's so high. And boxers, my God, I always think that boxing is a sport that's, there to cause brain injury. I mean, a TKO.
It does. I mean, look at Muhammad Ali. I mean,
I know.
that's so clear.
Yeah.
That one of the best athletes in the world, near the end, he could barely even speak because he
Yes,
sustained so much trauma to the head.
exactly.
So,
Yeah.
traumatic brain. We've talked traumatic brain injury in our field for many, many years.
Yeah.
But what we're still not doing is talking about how that can impact the way we provide services. And there's another statistics, and we see that the sexual behaviors can become very prevalent too. So even if a person didn't have concerning sexual behaviors in our system before, that can start to become a problem. When I get a referral and someone says, okay, this person's in their 60s or their 70s and they're having problematic sexual behaviors, I scratch my head and go, why is that just coming out now?
Exactly.
And if
Yeah.
you can't see changes within the environment, I tell people you just have to make sure you're getting a full medical workup to try to rule out dementia. And more often than not, it comes back with even the CT scans, because that's how bad it's gotten. You
Oh
can
boy.
see the white matter of the brain actually has changed. So
Yes.
the pendulum swings to more than likely it is dementia. And Alzheimer's is the number one cause of dementia. The medical piece, and we say that with any challenging behavior that we see in our system, always rule out the medical, because that's the easiest thing to rule out. You have more concrete evidence with that.
Yes. I had a situation once with a young man who was on a few medications. He had a job in the community and was a pretty independent fellow in his 30s, I think. And all of a sudden he started to get erections, and he was very happy about that. And he would say, "Hey, look at this." And he lost his job, and I mean, it was terrible. And he kept saying, I don't know why, I can't help it. And he was being restricted. And I actually got his list of medications and consulted we had a medical, I think we still do, a medical doctor for the state of Pennsylvania. And he looked, there was a change in medication a month or two before, and he just, it's right here. And it was the new medication increased sexual arousal. So I mean, it had nothing to do with the choices he was making. It
Yeah.
was terrible, but we switched it around. But I mean, if no one had figured that out, if they hadn't contacted me and I didn't contact the doctor, I can't even imagine what would have happened to that guy. It's multi-layered. Or a urinary infection. Someone's
Yes.
scratching and irritated, and then they, it's all the general same area. They may then start to masturbate, or maybe not. They think they're masturbating.
Yes. And I used to get called in to do like behavior consulting in some of these nursing, specifically the Alzheimer's units. And that was a big one for women. They, oh my gosh, she's masturbating in the commonplace. Here she had a UTI.
Yeah.
So the other thing, just the environment in general. I've been in quite a few nursing homes, and you walk in some of those and it feels like it's, the gates of hell, because they have the heat up so high too.
That's true.
As you
Yeah.
get older, you get colder, but that's not true for everyone, especially those of us that have Irish blood running through us. We don't like the heat. So I got a call.
It's,
This woman was disrobing. And I said, for Christ's sake, you have the heat on in like the 80s. Let's just see if maybe we turn down the heat a little bit, or maybe get her something a little lighter to wear, if
yeah.
that helps. And sure enough, it did. Because again, behavior is communication.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You
Oh
were
dear.
talking earlier too, and that was before I hit the record button, about concerns related to giving consent. So when you're talking dementia, the ability to give and receive consent, I think that gets really, really tricky.
Hmm.
And the other problem, and as I'm looking at the screen too, people demanding or requesting or looking for sex even shortly after they've had it. Well, a lot of people with dementia forget what they just did. And I don't
Yes.
mean that to be facetious, but that's not a surprise to me.
No, it's not. Yeah, I just spent some time with a dear friend who's has Alzheimer's, and it was the repetition was just astounding to me. I hadn't seen him in a while. I can understand that. I can, and having just sort of seen it with a fairly young person.
It's
70 is
sad,
pretty
it's
young.
exhausting, it's frustrating, it's sadder. And I try to almost forewarn people and tell people this is going to be emotionally taxing, and it will be physically taxing as you go the distance and loving and supporting someone with
Absolutely.
dementia.
And then again, I think this we see the same thing wherever there are people providing support to others. We have to look at the providers of that support and what they're seeing and what they're feeling themselves and what they're understanding. So the training that they understand, again, their religion, their culture, their all of that they're not making a judgment. They're understanding what's going on, and they can support the person, step away from their own baggage or whatever we want to call it, and be a real support for the person. And I think that's very difficult when it comes to sexuality. And when I think about people in nursing homes that where it could have been somebody's doctor or lawyer, and then here's the staff person now supporting them, and they're having inappropriate behavior, inappropriate behavior,
Mhm.
and that's got to be difficult for them. It absolutely does.
Helping staff, and this is why a lot of providers in our system are coming and asking for this training. If you understand logically what's happening to a person, I think it helps you to maintain empathy. And empathy doesn't mean feeling sorry for someone, but it
Oh,
means being able to put yourself in their shoes and
yeah,
understand things a little bit better. And I think if you have empathy and you can establish and maintain that, it makes doing the work just a little bit easier.
yeah. When things get difficult, no matter what it is, it's almost like emotional intelligence in a way. But it's bigger than that. It's deeper than that. It's being really able to identify in your heart with what's going on with the person, even if it's something that's so offensive, may be offensive to you. Something popped up on Facebook the other day. A woman who I don't know. She looked undone, and there was a picture of her being arrested for something that she did. I don't know what it was, but there were all these jokes about her. She's a lunatic. What are, and I don't like to get into things on Facebook, but I just said, has anybody thought that she may be in a mental health crisis? Like
Right.
it's yeah, we tend to jump to something that they're doing wrong, and what they're doing maybe illegal, maybe getting them into trouble, or that they may hurt someone or themselves in some way, but they don't know what they're doing. And we've got to be the ones that step in there and help them to be safe.
That's a really important point, Sharon. I mean, we're I think all a stone's throw away from having a nervous breakdown.
Okay.
And I don't think people really even understand what that means. And really what that means is your body and your brain are under so much stress and duress that you kind of snap. You just emotionally like lose it, where you could become aggressive, you could become suicidal, you could literally be vomiting and passing out. I mean, it could be any one of them because your brain is just so overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And I think people who survive a lot and who endure a lot and carry a lot on their shoulders. And when you're looking at dementia and you're looking at the brain, one of the first areas for the brain to be hit is the frontal lobe. And that the frontal lobe controls your impulses, it controls your ability to problem solve, it controls your personality, your behaviors. I mean, that is really sort of the crux of our ability to think through and problem solve and execute those. We talk a lot about frontal lobe damage for the people that we support. Fetal alcohol syndrome, that's the frontal lobe that's impacted. But this is also, and again, you can start to show signs 20 years before you're even diagnosed with anything. So having that understanding is really important. And then of course, as it progresses, the disease, because it's neurological, you'll start to see other things impacted, to the point where a person, they literally forget how to swallow, and they can't. So another big thing that I try to impress upon people is start having those conversations. And that's sort of a
Exactly.
side plug for just planning when you're supporting someone with dementia. But I
Yeah.
know we're not addressing that today.
Yeah, I'm looking at the one lobe there, the perception, making sense of the world, arithmetic, and spelling. That's so interesting. Because one person that I know that is absolutely brilliant and has dementia. If you ask them two and two at this point, they'd say, I don't know.
But that sensory cortex too, the part of the brain that controls the senses, I think when talking about sexuality, that's an important thing too. So you have the impulsive piece going on, but as you were saying too, that human beings have a need for physical touch.
Yeah,
Human beings have a need for connection. So you were talking about the different things that can be done. I've, often tossed around, why are we so opposed to doing things like massage, even for
yeah,
the people that we support, as long as the boundaries are very clear, because we need that. We're so opposed
absolutely.
to people having pets. I would die without my pets. I know I couldn't function, because it
Yeah,
gives, there's that sensory piece. I can just sit and pet a dog or pet a cat, and I can literally feel my blood pressure come down.
I totally understand that. The people that we're supporting and people with in nursing homes, overlapping groups, do the people that support them know what their lives were? What's no longer there? Not that every staff person needs to know everyone's life history, but there are some things that are just really, really important. And that's why there should be animals in nursing homes. And there are in
And I think
many.
they should be in group homes too. I really,
Yeah.
they should
Yeah,
be.
I do too.
I have seen people come alive. I had a dog I used to take into the nursing home, but it also, again, it provides that need for physical connection too.
It does. I know that there's some folks that do hand massage. It just sitting with someone and massaging their hands, and that helps. I mean, it's not superficial, but it's not a good shoulder and back massage or head massage. I mean, all those things are so wonderful, but there's concern about crossing lines and liability and all of that. But there has to be a way to do that, and
In this training, it's listed as factors that contribute to quote unquote inappropriate sexual behaviors, which, I don't like that word, but who I
yeah,
created this for, they were using that. So I maintained the use of that. So and the one thing we're kind of going over, we talked about unmet medical needs that could be contributing to the problem. Discomfort, going back to the senses. I'm one of those people too. I'm very fussy about the clothes I wear. They always have to be bigger, because I don't like anything tight on me whatsoever. I sweat and I'm ripping off a shirt, or I'm ripping clothes off when I get hot, or I'm irritated by things. Of course, I have the wherewithal at this point to know who's around and where I'm at, and
yeah, yeah,
whether or not it's okay or it's not okay. But when you start to have the brain affected in the way that it's affected with dementia, you lose the ability to sort of process and problem solve that. And you're
yeah,
just going to whip things off, like you were saying about the gentleman who peed in the plant. It
yeah,
happens. I don't know how nursing homes or even providers in our system handle that sort of thing too, because we're so quick to say we have to do an investigate, we have to do an incident report, and we have to investigate this.
yeah,
I mean, I get so irritated with stuff like that. It's like, again, in our system, the pendulum always seems to swing. We go from one extreme, right, where we're like killing people, to the other extreme of we have to do an incident report and an investigation for why a leaf fell on the kitchen floor. It's like just extreme,
exactly.
where I think we really have to individualize things. And I found that I've started writing in some of the behavior support plans that I do, this person is prone to do X, Y, and Z. Before filing a report and launching an investigation, do this, and this, and talk to this person, and this person, and we'll collectively make the decision on whether or not that's to proceed. But it's supposed to happen within 24 hours, because I think there is always a middle ground. with
Yeah.
everything, whether it's politics or it's policies or it's opinions. There's an
Yeah, exactly.
and we need to get to that.
One of the things that I've seen, and I certainly you have as well, are when two people are caught or discovered together having doing something sexual, and a report has to be done. What the reality of the whole situation is, they're two people who want to be together, and they'll do it in the bushes, they'll do it at 2 o'clock in the morning, they'll sneak into each other's rooms, they'll do whatever it takes, but nobody's helping them to figure it out, so they just catch them, and then you end up with a victim and an offender.
Right.
And that's, so I've seen it over and over and over. And sometimes the result of it is that they transfer one person out of the group home to another, and that then there's heartbreak. They're separated from the person that they deeply care about, and we just don't see that. We see it as bad and wrong and shameful and inappropriate. What's really inappropriate is that we're doing nothing about it. We're
Well,
not
that's how we
looking deeper and
respond to
helping
it.
them.
Yeah, it's
Exactly.
shame on us because what should happen is you take those two people, you talk to them separately, and ask them how they feel,
Exactly. Yeah.
right? And that should
Yeah.
mitigate the whole thing in that
Yeah.
circumstance. But as you
Yeah.
described, we just go to the extreme. And what it also does, especially with larger organizations and nursing homes, so you go through the whole victim, perpetrator, do this, do that. You just opened yourself up for a hell of a lawsuit too.
That would be true. Yeah.
Because you've done all this and you've identified a victim and a perpetrator, and in some cases there are, which again is why we have to carefully examine each one.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
We
Yeah.
have to do that because it does happen. I mean, I've seen where there were, predators in nursing homes. Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah.
that I've
Oh,
worked with
yeah.
people and said we have to make sure we have door alarms. We have to make sure that that person is getting a higher level of supervision, or they need moved to an area where they have less likely access to the. You have to make those accommodations, but again, shame on us.
It is so frustrating. It really is. Yeah. And that's why one of the things I think that just keeps me going, because yeah, I care so much about the people we support. And in so many cases, we're not doing what we should do. And it's us, it's not them. It's us as the professionals, that we have our own stuff that we can't get past, and the whole big system. I couldn't even tell you how many people I knew that were caught in some situation in the bathroom at the day program, whatever it might be. But instead of sitting down and figuring out what's going on, they end up getting labeled, and there's a very sad ending there. It's not good.
and
But
and
on the other hand, if there is someone that is an offender that's moving from one vulnerable person to another, we're not excusing that, of course. But look at it and figure it out. What's really going on, instead of saying bad, no
yeah,
more, stop it, that's bad, you're inappropriate.
as you talk, I always think too, and the stories start to roll into my head. Working for the Alzheimer's Association, there were plenty of people, and you were talking about this too, who would engage in sexual activity together, and they weren't married. They didn't even really know each other. They had a feeling. There was a feeling, and it was like these relationships were sort of budding. And the hardest thing I ever did to do was call a wife and say, "Your husband is having a relationship with someone.
Yeah.
You have to know about it because he's not able to control himself." And she cried and she said, "I know that, but I also know that he still loves me."
Well, I had a situation once that I smiled just thinking about it. When our six kids were still pretty young, we took my grandfather in our home to live with us, and he was 94. And he called my grandmother's name was Helen, but he called her Ella. And one day he looked at me, and my grandmother was about maybe 5 foot. She was a little beanie Irish woman. And I don't think we looked alike, but I think maybe there was a resemblance. But my grandfather was in his room, and I went to check on him or give him a coffee. I don't know why I went in. He said, Ella, and he patted the bed and he said, sit down, honey. So I sat on the side of the bed, and he took my hand and he said, it is so good to see you. I've missed you. and in that moment, I was my grandmother and he was just patting my hand. It was so interesting. But what was I going to say? No, no, grandpa, it's me. Don't pull my hand. Of course not. I mean, just it was such an eye opener that he was in another place. And I gave him that little gift that I was my grandmother. He could hold my hand for a little bit. I mean, somebody might have thought that was, I mean, it wasn't a sexual thing at all. I mean, it was just like, I've missed you. And he just was just as he would have done if it was my grandmother, because that's who he thought I was. Yeah, I just think about people who can give consent, but they're going to forget that they gave it 10 minutes later. And that's a tricky one for nursing homes to have to deal with.
And in nursing homes, I mean, they're kind of putting people in there together. And that's what I'm saying, that in our service system, that people are being supported for as long as they can be supported in a group home. But inevitably, they end up in a facility like a nursing home because their care needs are so great as the disease
Yes.
progresses. So they are mixed in with different, genders. And I have not seen segregated in terms of gender nursing homes. I haven't seen it. I don't know if you've seen anything like that.
No, I have not. No.
I've just seen the specific Alzheimer's units where they're locked units and they do things a little bit differently for the people in that unit. So, we talk all the time about how our folks that we support have had very little exposure and opportunity to engage in intimate sexual relationships. So the impulse control has been affected by the disease. Even hypersexuality, that sensation, that piece, people become hypersexual when dementia hits that part of the brain too. So we have to be prepared for what that means. There's a lot of smacking of the butts of the nurses and very sexual comments and statements. I see that now in group homes for people with dementia. I had one guy, he would refer to the female staff by how big he thought their boobs were. He couldn't
Oh,
remember their names. So
oh,
really hypersexual. He'd be like, Sean, here comes double D. Oh my God. Let's try not to call her that. But we had to make another association. So I worked with him. Okay, let's just focus. What's the color of her eyes? He
yeah,
couldn't remember the names, and it was hit or miss in terms of him doing.
yeah,
It started to become a problem, a real problem.
yeah. And when you think about no matter where a person is working, if you are supporting them with a nursing home or a group home or what have you, and we've talked about this all the time, and it's probably my biggest issue. Like, what's the problem here? It's us. It's us. It's the people that love and care for and support people, but we're dragging our own stuff around. I mean, if we were, molested as a kid or have someone in the family that was, and then somebody touches us in a way, or we see them touch someone in a way, it just strikes something in your core. But you've got to be aware of it and take a deep breath and know that that's not the same thing. You've got to be able to support the person that is in front of you. And
Some of
yeah.
the intervention strategies that are the same intervention strategies that I recommend when we're trying to teach people about legal and illegal and private and public. So the same is true for if a person has dementia and they're starting to exhibit some of these more problematic sexual behaviors. Just making sure they understand where a private place is, labeling a private place. So your bedroom is really the only private place in the house unless you have your own bathroom then too. But keeping people busy. I've had people that were in wheelchairs and they may or may not have had dementia, but they were touchy-feely kind of people and they were grabbing rear ends as they were in line at the grocery store. And so I would take things and make sure they had things to hold in their hands to keep their hands busy, because if your hands are busy, then they're not going to be as inclined to be grabbing cheeks either. Be mindful of the space between them and
Exactly.
other people too. I mean, these are just pretty basic things that, as a person starting to show problems in this area, that you can make as an accommodation to kind of reduce some of the challenges too.
It's such a simple thing. Such a simple thing. Give them something to hold and fiddle with or whatever. I love that. It's a really good idea.
Well, I had one guy, he
Somebody
was
busy.
very religious and he'd always say he prayed for everyone as they came in the house, but he started to have some touchy-feely issues. So before we went into the community, I gave him, he had his what are the beads? The Catholic beads. The
Rosaries.
rosary. Listen to me. I was going to call it the crucifix.
Well, that if the cross is on the bead, it
Yes.
is the crucifix.
So he had his rosary beads and his little tiny Bible, and off we went.
Yeah. Well, that's that's great.
Keep those hands busy.
Yeah.
But being honest with people too, very in the moment, being honest with people, like I'm not okay with this, or it's making me feel uncomfortable. So, just asking people, and again, they'll probably give it to you in the moment, but then they're going to forget it and do it again. So,
Exactly. So just say it again. Yeah. Say
yeah.
it again. Yeah. The whole private bathroom thing is, I mean, it's not funny because people have been gotten into legal trouble. But if we just say masturbation is all right in a bathroom, that's not okay. It has to be a bathroom, your own bathroom at home is with the door closed, or a private bathroom that's you're the only locked. It's a locked bathroom. But if you just say it's okay in a bathroom, they go to McDonald's or whatever. And we've had that happen so many times. And whose fault is it? It's ours for not giving them the right information, enough information.
So even if people are in the group home setting and things start to change because of dementia, we still have to look at some of the core components that we often talk about and preach on. And that's the need to make sure we're establishing policies around sexual relationships and behavior. And that includes policy and training on abuse and sexual consent. I've been preaching about this until I'm blue in the face. I will say I'm being monitored right now. The county's doing their monitoring, and this is the first time Allegheny County has asked for a policy on a sexuality policy. So it's coming, folks, which it should be, because we've been talking about it forever. So let's do it.
We have, yeah. I mean, you just can't go around like the old Wild West or something. You've got to have guidelines that, and the guidelines that the people we support know too, that they understand, that there are limits on all of us and what we can and can't do, and when and where and why and all of that. But we need it written in policy. Absolutely.
I just envision if you don't have policies and procedures that you actually follow, and that's the other thing. You can be monitored and say you have a policy, but are you actually implementing? It's almost like you're building the plane as you're flying it. And when we talk about, we're so tired of being reactive. Well, if you built the plane and you had it done right, you wouldn't be hitting the emergency button as you're in the air either.
We are.
So if you're going to write the policies, make sure you're implementing the policies too.
Yeah. And again, we've talked about it before. The whole Safer Options Training Institute, we looked at supporting people who had problematic sexual behavior or who were sexual offenders. But if we had done upfront things and we had policies in agencies and training and support for staff, there would be a lot of people that did not end up having problematic behavior.
And when thinking about dementia, it's been a sad thing for me to see, because a lot of the people, well, actually all of them at this point that I've worked with who developed dementia, they were moved into nursing homes, and rather quickly too. And I think, why can't we be better prepared too? And I mean, these are people who are still walking, they're still talking, they're still partially feeding themselves. I mean, meaning they need someone there to kind of coach them through doing it, because you forget literally what to do with a spoon sometimes too.
Yeah.
But I think the move to nursing homes, I understand it, but I feel like it's sort of premature too, because we just weren't prepared, and we weren't willing to sort of think outside of the box to create and provide what the person may need in order to be safe and happy. Again, we're reactive. So they have this now, they have to go.
And I think, I mean, I hope this isn't true, but I think that there are some, or maybe many people that feel like people they're supporting have an intellectual disability or developmental disability, and that's it. It's because they have a disability. They're just not quite right, and they don't get the separation of things. That this is because of this and this is because of this, and they're not the same thing. Just because someone has an intellectual disability and does something, it's not because of the intellectual disability, it's because they have some dementia.
Yes.
The different thing.
And a lot of people don't want to deal with it too. Trying to get nursing home placement it's a huge challenge now, just like anywhere, because of staffing issues. But when you have the label of intellectual disability with a dementia, nursing homes are usually very afraid of that, and saying,
Yeah.
you don't know how to handle that. There are so many great providers who are doing it, and they're trying to do it, but how can we sort of use the system from which we work in to wrap that support around that individual and that organization too? So when you were talking about support for the staff, when I was at the Alzheimer's Association, we had a support group for people with the early stage dementia, but also for their caregivers. So whether that
Yeah.
was a spouse or a family member or a friend, we had neighbors, we ran those two support groups because again, it's an emotional investment. It's a roller coaster ride in trying to manage this sort of thing with any human being.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend recently whose partner has some dementia and repeats and repeats. I said, but he's not violent. And he just looked at me and said, well, not that you've seen, but he has outbursts where he swings at him. And, I just can't even imagine it because this partner is the sweetest, gentlest human. He still is, but he has Alzheimer's.
So again, providers, if you're listening, you're supporting someone who is getting, and when I say getting older, even in their 50s, and you start to see an abrupt change, we
Yeah.
have to start looking at this stuff because it could be something else other
Yeah.
than what we just assume at first.
And I think people with Down syndrome seem to develop dementia at an earlier age.
They
I
do.
think I read that statistic
Yes.
somewhere.
Yeah. And there's this, I remember from the work I did before that 100% of people with Down syndrome, if they live long enough, will develop some form of dementia.
Yeah.
But there's a cardiovascular component to that too. So again, the umbrella of dementia, right? So here's dementia. There are lots of things that can cause dementia. The vascular piece, so mini strokes can cause it. High blood pressure, if the arteries are clogged and it's impacting the heart, it's impacting the brain because the heart
Exactly.
is what pumps everything to your brain too, that your brain needs in order to survive and be well. So using drugs and alcohol, we're in a crisis. We've been in a crisis. That's all we hear about in terms
Yes.
of the opioid epidemic. Overuse of drugs and alcohol will also put you at a much higher risk of forming some form of dementia. I think people just don't know that. That's
Yeah.
why we're seeing more and more of it happening too with
Mhm.
younger and younger people.
Well, it's wonderful to be doing this work, but there's a lot of it to be done.
I love working in dementia, but I also just love working with older people. And again, usually it is older people that you end up working with. But I think that's why I like working with non-speaking people too, because it requires you really, again, to pay attention. It requires you to really be in the moment with people. I would much rather do that and have those moments of just sheer happiness where a
Yeah.
person smiles and you're having just a moment together than have someone sitting there complaining about everything that's wrong in their life all the time.
And I, of course, was witness to one of those moments when I was visiting you and the two moms and the young people. I believe he was a mainly non-speaking young man who, at some point during the session, burst into song. He was singing along with everybody. And his mother was just like, oh my God, look at this.
Yeah, and he was someone who he didn't speak. I will never forget the first time he came here to see me with his mom. And I talked to him just like I'm talking to you. And he lit up like nothing I've ever seen before. I kept persisting, and one day I just held him. He's got a lot of sensory issues, and we had our hands together, and I just started going row because it felt like we were rowing, and I said it feels like we're rowing, and I started to sing row, row, row your boat. Not because I was treating him like a child, but it was just that moment we were having, and he started to sing with me.
Oh my.
That was the first time his voice had been heard in
Wow.
many, 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 many years.
Yep.
I'm not saying that's going to happen with everyone, but whether we're talking dementia, intellectual disabilities, autism, a combination of all of it.
Of all of it.
Pay attention, be in the moment, presume a person's intellect. That's
Yes.
too. If you have dementia, you're still hearing, you're still feeling. I was on life support after heart surgery, completely out of it. I still heard and remembered everything that was said around me. In fact, they
Yeah.
never really went away. They're all there and they're trapped in their body.
And it's interesting because sometimes I think that the people that do the supporting think that they're not good enough or not smart enough. They can't get it all. But that's not, it's just not true. You don't need a PhD or a million letters behind your name. I always think of my other grandmother. I mean, I loved both of my grandmothers, but one lived with us and she'd gone to third grade. She was the wisest person I ever met, and she was unconditional in how she interacted with people. It wouldn't matter if it was her doctor or the trash guy or the people that rode the rails and came to our house for a handout, and there was a symbol on our fence in the backyard, but
Yeah.
she just was non-judgmental and kind.
So Sharon, how do we teach that? And I think that's where I'm exhausted. And I
Yeah,
get I hate when people say, well, you're Sean McGill, you can do it. That doesn't mean
yeah,
anything. That has no weight. There's no validity in using someone's name or saying because someone is this or that. Just be present, be mindful.
yeah. I think people feel it gets old when or maybe, we say that you got to, get educated around this stuff, look at your own baggage and stuff. But it's not that. Like I did my practicum at Camp Hill Prison on the sex offender unit. And I've had people say, how could you ever do that? How could you work with those people? They're sex offenders. And I say to them, that's what they did. It's not who they are. And that's what I say to the people that did the offenses as well. Who are you really underneath this? And that's where you get to the point where you can help them not to be who they were, not to do what they did, to dig down and find out the reasons. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't take a genius. It just takes someone who gets it, who can put aside their own ego and whatever and really relate to another human.
Because
Yeah,
at the end of the day, we're all turning to dust. No one cares what you've accomplished in terms of your degrees or your publications. No one
that's
cares
right.
the day.
No,
What people will remember, in Maya Angelou's, and I've repeated this, they won't remember what you did. They'll remember how you made them feel.
I saw something, I was probably on Facebook. I don't know where it was, but it was just an older man sitting on a rock or something. I don't know. But there was a question and it said, what do we do for others? And the response from the man was, there are no others. We're all the same thing. We are the others. We're all one ball of wax. And that's true.
That is probably the most critical thing in teaching people about dementia or even working with people with intellectual disabilities. Thank you for tuning in for another episode of Two Old Sexperts.